John Redwood. A very good afternoon, John. How are you?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to all your audience. Well, I'm in great form, although the news isn't too good today.
No, it's not. We've loads to talk to you about. I said earlier, John, I don't really want to make it about Gregg Wallace because he's denied those allegations, and that's an ongoing thing. I find it almost, and loads of people agreeing with us, that the state broadcaster, we know by looking at the content that comes out of the BBC nowadays that it's so woke, and I mean, they won't call Hamas terrorists, they're anti-Donald Trump, and yet they're pro-every whatever, the way they report stuff. But they have form. I mean, when you look at Savile and Martin Bashir and Hugh Edwards, I'm sorry, I think they need to be more answerable for the money that we have to pay them, don't you?
Yeah, it's a complete disgrace. I mean, the past cases where it was proven that these people were criminals or were misbehaving very badly, it took them so long to find that out and to clear it up. And now we have this totally unsatisfactory position where we have a number of complainants with complaints going back a very long time. You know, where were the managers? Where were the other people in the studio doing the filming? Didn't they have a view on this? Didn't they have a judgment at the time about whether something was appropriate or not? And it's totally unfair on the public. And on Gregg Wallace, if he does have a good defence, we need to know now if this man has a good defence or whether all the complainants are right, in which case it's quite obvious what the BBC has to do. They've got to apologise again and completely change the way they recruit these people, because in the past, they've recruited a lot of wrong ones.
I mean, that's the point. They ran Savile, a BBC Christmas special of Jimmy Savile, 3 months after they knew what he was up to. I mean, he was one of the most heinous criminals, paedophiles ever. Hugh Edwards, people say, oh, you are sometimes a bit harsh to Hugh Edwards. He's got mental problems. I bet he wouldn't have stopped doing what he was damn well doing. What I get wound up about is that yours and my tax paid him 200 grand whilst the BBC knew that he was that these allegations were made. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary.
Well, and the whole payment system is ridiculous because they create these so-called talents by giving them so much screen time and building them up. And then they pay them as if that was all their creation, whereas somebody else could have come along with the BBC behind it and also become famous because they had quite a big audience. Yeah. And you even get it with the football commentators. You get someone who's being distinguished in football, and then you pay him an unbelievably large sum of money, which has to be financed by us, the licence payer taxpayers. And you seem to think that he's quite unique in being able to do that job, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who know a lot about football who could do a perfectly good job introducing a few games. And what most people watching that programme want to do is to see more of the football. They don't need more talking.
Are you a football fan, John?
I quite like football. Cricket is my preferred game, but yeah, I like a bit of sport.
Good man. Let's go. That's the BBC. And listen, please phone them. Tell us what you think of the BBC. But everybody seems to be saying, you know, it seems to not understand how people are really hacked off with the way that there's no trust, there's no justification, this pious we're better than all of you rubbish that comes from the BBC. And yet, if you strip down their content, John Redwood, it's bias, isn't it? It's totally biased.
Well, of course. I mean, it's choice of subject above all else. I mean, a number of times you and some of the other alternative programmes and news channels run a story or a piece of research I've done because you think it has national interest, and the BBC won't touch it.
Of course not.
Because it hasn't been given to them by the Labour Party or by the Bank of England or whoever it is that they need to have endorsing something as a story.
Completely agree.
The whole point about challenge is the media have to sometimes say, Bank of England, you're wrong, or Labour or Tory parties, you're not the sole source of information about British politics.
Completely agree. Moving on, though, to Starmer the farmer harmer, to Keir. I don't know what to think anymore, because Sunday I read he's siding up to Trump, the realisation that Donald Trump is going to change foreign policy in the world. The fact is he got elected, that's the way it is, and his response to that was, me and David Lammy had lunch with him, and David Lammy had 2 portions of chicken. Today, he says, I'm not going to side with the US against Europe. Europe is important. I would suspect, as Freddie Gray said earlier, that Donald Trump is going to play Keir Starmer like a good one, don't you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Keir Starmer is true to form, isn't he? He's an international lawyer who thinks that international courts, even when they're just advising or they don't have jurisdiction over us, take priority over the views of the British people and the needs of the United Kingdom. And he flip-flops a lot. And so when he goes to see President Macron, it's a European love-in, and when he goes to see Trump briefly, it's an American love-in. And then when he has to try and make a speech about both of them, he understandably says we've got to get on with both of them. I don't disagree with that. But the issue here is that we have a free trade agreement bought at enormous cost with the European Union. So there's no tariffs going to be flying around within that free trade agreement. We never got a free trade agreement with the United States because the EU couldn't manage to negotiate one for us and the other member states. We actually have an opportunity with Donald Trump to have a free trade agreement. And he was quite keen for Mrs. May and Ollie Robbins to negotiate one when they were running the place. And they said, oh, no, we can't do it too early. We've got to have left first. And you think, well, why on earth couldn't you have negotiated it ready for the day you leave? Anyway, that was a missed opportunity. I think there's another possible opportunity now, because with Trump wanting to threaten players around the world where he wants to change his policy or where he thinks they're not trading fairly with big tariffs, there's no reason why we should cop out for any of that, because we're a very free trader and we have a very open market for imports. And so this surely is the opportunity for Starmer, for once in his career, to do something brave and to say, yes, he wasn't my choice of president, but he is the president of the United States of America. It's in our mutual interest. Let's carve out a free trade agreement so that Britain isn't in the eye of the storm when the tariffs are flying around.
Mate, I completely agree with you, but there's no chance of him being brave because he's too busy. I said it in the election. For me, his tent is so large with so many different factions that I don't believe momentum's disappeared from the Labour Party, that he spends his entire time trying to play to every single different faction, which results in nothing creative. It's all reactive, and it just never comes across as genuine. I really love your take on this. I mean, you were in how many years were you in Parliament? 28?
I did 37 years in Parliament.
Jesus, man. Political donations may be capped by Dreary's Keir amid rumours of Elon Musk threatening to give Reform 100 million quid. That's just sour grapes, isn't it, Sir John Redwood?
Well, it could be. And I think if you're going to try and reform donations, it is very important to get cross-party agreement, because otherwise it looks like trying to rig. And you couldn't, for example, I think, put a strict cap on entrepreneurs or business British donations to a party and not do the same to trade unions, for example, because that would be obviously unfair. And it would be wrong for a single case to make bad law. So there is this story that maybe Reform is about to get a very large sum of money. I'd be a bit surprised, but they might do. But you shouldn't make that the reason why you suddenly change the rules. You've got to have a rule that is good for many decades, and a rule which gets the buy-in of most people and most parties.
What's your overview, very quickly before I go abroad? What's your overview of the first 5 months of this? You're out of it now, but it's been an interesting time for this Labour Party, hasn't it?
Well, I'm really sad, because obviously it wasn't the party I wanted to win the election, but when they won the election, I said, well done, and I bought into their main aims. I mean, they said they were going to sort out the illegal migration. They said they were going to make us the fastest growing economy in the G7. They said they were going to do something about law and order, and these are all good things. And I said, yeah, go for it. Very good. And if you get it right, I'll say well done, you know. And then a few months later, they've broken all the promises. I think we're about this week to see them back off the idea that we can be the fastest growing economy, because their budget policies do the complete opposite. And they cripple all sorts of businesses with very high taxes. They're undermining the family farm. They're closing down our oil and gas fields as quickly as possible. They're making energy so expensive in this country that we're losing one of our big refineries, and we're losing the whole of our basic steel industry. So this is a party which promised so much. And unbelievably, for a Labour Party that always was close to the industrial unions, is now deindustrialising Britain at an even faster pace than the previous government was.
Completely agree. Listen, before we let you go, and it's great to have you on, martial law declared this afternoon or earlier today. Weird. South Korea's president stands up on television and declares martial law. Basically, that puts the military in charge, sort of on-off situation. But I mean, Freddie Gray alluded earlier that this is because he believes there's outside pressure from North Korea, and opposition parties are taking influence from that man whose name I never, ever get right. But Freddie Gray said this man is under real pressure. There's fraudulent claims. There's electioneering camp. This is probably just him using a political trick. Thoughts on this, Sir John?
Well, I don't know the detail, and that may be right, but I do know that a number of Korean presidents got into difficulties and ended up with big rows or being prosecuted or whatever. So it's clearly not an easy job, but it does seem very odd in a democracy where there's plenty of Western and American support if there is a threat from North Korea, to have someone take this preemptive action, because I think a lot of his own party disagree with it, and of course the whole of the opposition disagrees with it. They got disagreements. They need to sort them out in Parliament in a democratic way. That's the obvious advice.
Agreed. Before we let you go, we have some breaking news. I'd love your response to this, John. I hope you don't mind me throwing this at you. We've just heard that after 33 years in the Conservative Party, Tim Montgomerie, a former advisor to Boris Johnson, the creator and editor of Conservative Home, has joined Reform UK. I'll be with Kevin O'Sullivan, 7:30 tonight, a world exclusive. Tim Montgomerie, who's been a massive advocate for the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson, has joined Reform UK. So, John Redwood, your response to that?
Well, I'd like to see Tim's reasons, and I would listen very carefully to what he's got to say. But it shows the challenge for the new leader, Kemi Badenoch, that Labour is destroying itself and is losing popularity very rapidly, so it makes beating them a lot easier. But we're not going to end up with a different government if Reform and Conservatives are locked in a long battle and they end up with rather similar shares of the vote. So somehow somebody has got to sort that out.
Do you imagine further down the line, because Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, regulars on this station will tell you they have no desire to have any sort of alliance with the Tory party. They believe that the Tory party is a busted flush. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch, as you said, the new leader, has not really been drawn on that. Do you see a political landscape where Reform and the Conservative Party do in some way either do an electoral deal or there is some sort of alliance at all?
Well, of course. I mean, if, for example, we get close to the election and neither Reform nor Conservatives are so far ahead of the other that it's quite obvious which is the winning ticket, then why wouldn't they do a deal? Because otherwise they're just going to thwart each other and you end up with a Labour government with some left-wing support from other parties, with even less support than it had at the last general election. But clearly, it's certainly in the run-up to May next year, with very important local elections, both Reform and Conservatives are going to go at this hammer and tongs, because it's going to be the first time Reform tries to put in a serious number of candidates in local government, and the Conservatives are clearly rallying from the low they hit by the rather foolish early general election. And I think Kemi says some very good things, and it'd be very interesting to see if that draws more support in. But that's what the next few months are about. It's about who is the dominant challenger. And remember, the Conservatives are still ahead in the polls of Reform, and they have all the advantages of being the official opposition. So they have some natural advantages in what is going to be quite a lively battle.
Love having you on, Sir John Redwood. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. 37 years in the House of Commons, now a free and kindred spirit. Sir John Redwood.